Good Sunday morning. Republicans are moving full steam ahead on tax reform this upcoming week after the House passes its budget resolution. Investigators are entering a second week trying to find a motive in the Las Vegas massacre. And the White House may be just days away from decertifying the Iran nuclear deal. Good morning, everyone. I'm Maria Bartiromo. Thanks so much for joining us. This is Sunday Morning Futures. The House approving a budget resolution along party lines late last week, helping to pave the way for tax reform. What are the biggest roadblocks now? I will talk with White House Budget Director Mick Mulvaney, as well as House Ways and Means Committee Chairman Kevin Brady. It has been nearly a week since a gunman shot and killed 58 people in Las Vegas. Are authorities any closer to finding a motive? Former Milwaukee County Sheriff David Clark will join me live. And the White House may soon decertify the Iran nuclear deal. Could happen this upcoming week. How will the U.S. handle Tehran going forward? I'll talk with House Armed Services Committee Chairman Mac Thornberry as we look ahead right now on Sunday Morning Futures. Republicans are now one step closer to one of their major priorities, the House passing a $4.1 trillion budget plan on Thursday along party lines, paving the way for tax reform. The vote comes as the Senate Budget Committee is considering a companion plan that differs in some key details. I want to bring in the Office of Management and Budget Director, Mick Mulvaney. And Director Mulvaney, it was good to see you. Thanks so much for joining us this morning.
Good morning, Maria. Thanks for having me.
So can you give us a status check? You had a victory in terms of the passage in the House on Thursday. Now we're waiting on the Senate Budget Committee. What are you expecting?
Actually, I think the Senate Budget Committee passed theirs this week, but so now it will go to the Senate floor the week after next. The Senate is in recess next week. We'll be back in their home states, and then they'll come back the following week, and we expect them to take it up, take the budget up on the floor of the Senate at that time. So that's what would happen next.
Is it? I mean, we're talking about some differences in terms of the Senate plan and the House plan. What are the key differences? Where could there be some disagreement?
There are a lot of differences, and there are, by definition, going to be some differences. Maria, the House and the Senate, believe it or not, use different rules, which I know bore people to death. But almost by definition, regardless of what's happening in the House process and the Senate process, there will always be some differences because the rules are different. But when you boil those all away and get down to the real sort of the brass tacks, the issues will be over all the details that you expect regarding reconciliation, specifically the size of the deficit. The Senate has that $1.5 trillion allowance for to allow the tax reforms to add to the deficit. The House doesn't have that. We do expect the House to go along with that if it passes out of the Senate. So we really don't see any, at this point at least, any difficulties with the budget part of this process. The challenges come as we will go beyond budget and start talking about the actual piece of tax legislation itself.
Yeah, I want to get into that tax legislation today. We've been covering the tax story for a long time. Love to get a little more detailed this morning. But let me ask you about this budget first, because a lot of people saying, yeah, this is an honest budget. But at the same time, this budget is making certain assumptions. For example, are you making the assumption that a repeal and replace of Obamacare is actually present here? Because you're making an assumption of all of these cuts to Medicaid and Medicare. Then there's additional cuts to Medicaid of $600 billion. Is this an assumption that the repeal and replace passes, or do these numbers just not add up?
Keep in mind, there's three budgets floating out there. There's still our budget that we introduced back in May, now the House budget and the Senate budget. I can speak to mine a little bit better than I can speak to the House or the Senate. We do assume that the Obamacare repeal and replace happens. But at the end of the day, Maria, it doesn't really make that much difference, because what will happen is that really the budget will set the spending levels for this year. That is the most important budget role of the budget. Yes, we've talked a lot about the reconciliation role of a budget as it relates to taxes, but the real driving force behind the budget in any particular year is setting the spending limits for the government for that year. That's what the budget does. So what we'll do now is work on aligning our budget with the House budget and the Senate budget as we go up to December, when we have to fund the government again. So I know we've sort of gone down two avenues, but that's the nature of the budget on Congress, is that, yes, it does deal with reconciliation, and taxes lie down that road, but it also deals with funding the government, which is an entirely separate question.
Yeah, I understand, but isn't this an assumption that you're going to be having all of this savings because of health care? And now we hear this morning, actually, that the president is once again in touch with Chuck Schumer and the Democrats in terms of their ideas on health care. So it may very well be a completely different budget when you've got the Democrat support coming in, and maybe this $600 billion in cuts on Medicaid don't happen at all.
Yeah, I don't think it would actually change the budget, because the budget will be set, I would assume, in the next couple of weeks, and anything can happen after that on any number of topics, from national defense to hurricane relief to Obamacare. That doesn't actually, you don't have to go back and change the underlying budget. To your point about the president talking with Democrats, I'm very much aware of that. He and I talked about it just yesterday, and he's deadly serious. He wants to find people who are willing to work with him to get things done. He was extraordinarily disappointed, as many of us were, that the Senate Republicans were again unable to deliver on that promise to repeal and replace Obamacare. And I don't think folks would blame him now for stepping back and saying, okay, if I can't work with that party, I'll go work with another party. So, but again, I don't think that ties in directly to the budget. You won't have to go back and redo the budget. You won't have to go back to the beginning of the tax process. You'll pass a budget in the next couple of weeks. You'll move to tax reform because of that budget, and other discussions on other topics will continue at the same time separately.
So what is your feeling in terms of deficit neutral, revenue neutral, when you look at a tax plan or overall the budget? I mean, when does the deficit and the debt of $20 trillion become sort of a near-term crisis situation?
The debt and the deficit is actually driving why we're doing what we're doing right now. I think a lot of us, myself included, have come to the conclusion that we are never going to solve our debt problem, our deficit problem, just on the spending side. We simply can't get Congress, there's not the political will on the parties to reduce the spending enough to balance the budget by itself. So we need to look at the revenue side, and that for us as Republicans means growth. We go back and, for example, look at the last time we balanced the budget in the late 1990s. The combination there was fiscal restraint. There were some spending reductions, most specifically in welfare reform, but it wasn't cutting our way to balance. What we did was we had fiscal restraint, slower growth in government expenditures, combined with dramatic growth in the size of the economy, the health of the economy, and thus government receipts. That's the model we're trying to get back to. So folks ask me, do you still care about the deficit? Yes, I do, but I think the best way to solve the deficit in the medium and the long term is by actually taking on some additional deficit now, so we can get the tax reform we need to get the economy back humming again at its healthy rate of at least 3%.
Yeah, I was just talking with my colleagues on Fox and Friends, and I said, look, back in 1984, you had a GDP of 7.3%. People forget that China numbers are actually possible if, in fact, we were to do the right things in terms of pulling back spending and lowering taxes to generate growth. But let me ask you about one of the big debates within the tax plan right now, and that is this elimination of the deduction of state and local income tax and property tax, which, of course, the high-earning states are complaining about. They're actually going to see their constituents have a tax increase, aren't they?
Again, anytime you look at a tax proposal and just look at one line, you can say, oh, well, this line will lead to the higher taxes, therefore it's a bad thing. You cannot look at it piece by piece. You have to look at it holistically. So when Chuck Schumer comes out and says that this is going to be a tax increase for every New Yorker, he's just simply wrong. He's ignoring the other things in the tax plan. But let's break down that state and local tax deductibility and why we're looking at it. It's fairly simple. Keep in mind, what's driving this for the president is sort of three things. He wants this to be a better tax system, a simpler tax system, and a fair tax system. And when I explain state and local deductibility, I simply like, look, Maria, if you and I make the same amount of money, we live in a house of the same value, our car is the same value, everything about us is the same except the state that you live in and the state that I live in, shouldn't we pay the same amount of federal tax? I think the answer is yes. I think a lot of people think the answer is yes. But the reality is no. Folks in Nebraska pay more federal tax, all other things being equal, than people do in California, and that's just not right. I think it helps contribute to the belief that the tax code is rigged in favor of certain people and against other people, and the president wants to fix that. So I'm happy to talk about the impact of state and local deductibility. I would like to do it, however, in the context of the larger tax bill. But when you're talking about just the policy of that one particular line item in the proposal, it is the absolute right policy to have.
Well, I could just pull out one thing as well and say, okay, I'm looking at the entirety of it, but how about the fact that the top 10% in terms of earners pay 80% of all the tax? So, I mean, what do you say to that?
We have the most progressive tax system in the world. We do. I think the bottom half of wage earners in the country don't pay any tax at all. In fact, folks, I think down below 40%.
Yeah, but I'm talking about the people that are going to get a tax increase, Director Mulvaney. I'm talking about the 10% top earners that pay 80% of the tax. They're going to get a tax increase. I understand the corporate rates coming down. You got the repatriation. You got the pass-through that's coming down. But when you're looking at the people who actually pay the most tax, they're getting a tax increase.
And Maria, I don't know how you can say that. We've talked about this before on your show. I've been on this show, and you've accused the tax program of raising taxes on the rich. And then I go on another network, and we all know which ones those are. In fact, it's every other network.
Yeah.
And they accuse us of cutting taxes on the rich. And I think the reason you're seeing that diversity of opinion is that we haven't set the brackets yet. We've set the principles. And people say, oh, that's not enough. No, that is a lot. To have Republican leadership in the House, the Senate, and the White House on the same page on some basic principles is a tremendous first step. In fact, I can make the case we're way far ahead on tax reform, or further ahead on tax reform than we are in health care, because we don't even have that basic principles, it doesn't seem, on health care. So we've not released the details. Why? Not because they're hidden. We don't have them in a vault someplace. We simply haven't settled on them yet. That will happen during the ordinary course of business in the House and the Senate as they make legislation. And it's very, very difficult, and I would suggest to you probably impossible, to actually look at a particular family or a group of Americans and say, your taxes are going to go up or your taxes are going to go down by this much until you know where those details are. And those details simply don't exist yet.
Is there a big debate happening around this idea of a fourth bracket? Do you think we will see a fourth bracket?
I can't speak to that directly, and that's a fair question, because I think what's driving this for the president's two sort of fundamental driving principles. He wants this to be lower taxes on the middle class and simpler on the middle class. That's one. And then he wants that lower corporate rate. So when you start talking about that fourth bracket, the top bracket, all we've said is, look, we're agnostic on the top bracket. If the House or the Senate want to talk about that, if they think that's what it takes to either get them where they want to be on the deficit, if it gets them where they need to be on the votes, we'll consider that. We're not driving that conversation, but that fifth bracket, right now we're at 0, 12, 25, and 35. Right. If they want to talk about something above that, then they should feel free to do so.
Well, I'm just trying to figure out where the whole idea of trickle-down economics went. I mean, for a long time, I was under the impression, like Reaganomics, that when you create an environment that is an attractive environment for the top earners, then they will follow through by creating jobs and investing in the economy, and there's so-called trickle-down economics. Are you just throwing away trickle-down economics and saying, no, we just want to focus on the middle class?
No, what we're looking at, Maria, and what's driving this is that it's the old modicum of the old maxim that a rising tide really does lift all ships. We're trying to get back to 3% growth. We're actually already there. The CEA put out, I think, a report this week saying that with tax reform, they actually think now they can get to 4% annual growth. That's fantastic. People don't realize how big a deal that is. It sounds like it's not that big a difference between 1.8 and 3%, and that is a huge difference, especially when you can sustain it for a long period of time. Yeah. A healthy American economy is a machine that creates wealth for everybody, and that's the machine we're trying to turn back on with this tax reform.
And that's what we want to see for sure. Well, we'll be watching. Certainly things have gotten better. I will definitely give you that. 3.1% last GDP. Director Mulvaney, good to see you. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Maria.
We will see you soon. Mick Mulvaney there. Still no motive for the Vegas shooter, meanwhile. There are new reports this morning, though, about his mental state. What investigators are looking at now. Former Sheriff David Clark will join me live next. Follow me on Twitter, at Maria Bartiromo, at Sunday Futures. Let us know what you'd like to hear this morning as we look ahead on Sunday Morning Futures right now. Welcome back. Investigators are still searching for a motive in the Las Vegas massacre, 1 week after the deadliest mass shooting in U.S. history. New reports this morning are suggesting that Stephen Paddock may have had a severe mental illness that went undiagnosed. Former Milwaukee County Sheriff David Clark is joining me right now. He's currently the spokesperson for America First Action, a Trump super PAC. Good to see you, Sheriff. Thanks very much for being here.
My pleasure, Maria.
So what do you think is going on here? I mean, extraordinary issues that we are following. Stephen Paddock with his 47 guns and his planning so meticulously, getting the hotel room that he wanted. What do you think the motive is?
Well, I want to downplay the role that motive plays in any of these investigations, whether it be Sandy Hook, the Orlando nightclub, Fort Hood, San Bernardino. And not so much the why is important to me, but the who. Who did this? I want to make sure, as an investigator, and I don't have inside information on this investigation going on in Vegas, but as a trained investigator and experienced, I want to make sure that we get all the actors, the co-conspirators, the people who might have helped plan. Because when we learned the motive of Sandy Hook and Orlando and Fort Hood and San Bernardino, it didn't bring anybody back. Look, 59 people are dead, 500 injured that'll be traumatized for a very long period of time. And so nothing really is going to change learning the motive. The motive is pretty clear to me. This guy wanted to slaughter people. It's like saying, why does a guy rob a bank? Because he wants money. So I think that's more important, the who than the why at this point. This is the tedious part of the investigation. Things start to slow down for the investigators. It's like emptying a box of a jigsaw puzzle. First, you have to turn all the pieces up right so you can see it. Then you sort them out. So now they're sorting through the evidence. I'll be doing a lot of evidence testing, forensics, to make sure that the weapons used were the ones that were fired. Were there other weapons? Were there other actors? Those are the things that are more important to the investigators than the why at this point.
Sure, sure. Well,
trying
that's
to
why
get
I
inside
ask you.
Paddock's head.
You are a trained investigator. So what are the authorities looking at right now? I mean, we thought maybe we would have some good intelligence after the interview with his partner and the girlfriend, live-in girlfriend, Miss Danley, and yet the FBI is not releasing really what they learned from her. Where do you think they are in the investigation? What are they turning over right now to try and get a better idea of what drove this guy?
Sure, and I don't want to get too much inside of their heads because, like I said, I'm not inside. But, like, going back to my experiences, they're going to go back over the witness statements. There's additional people they're going to want to interview. This is going to take a very long time, and I understand that the public gets a little restless at this stage because a lot of not new is coming out, and they want to know. We all want to know, but the fact is we have to let these people do their work. They're good at what they do, both the local investigators and the federal authorities, and they will give us the information when they deem it important and necessary. But the spoon feed and the drip, drip, drip of information, I think, can hurt sometimes because people start to fill in the gaps of stuff they don't know, and then all of a sudden conspiracy theories come out and things like that. So patience is what I always preach. These people are good at what they do, and at some point there'll be a final report as to everything that happened here. Maybe a better motive will be determined, but I still think that motive sometimes in these things is overrated. I think the guy's motive is he wanted to kill a lot of people.
Right. No, I understand that, and I agree with that. But we're just trying to understand what was going through his mind at this point. I mean, it was like sitting ducks there. Is there anything that the country should be doing to better protect ourselves, to not have a person be able to get in such a position to go so high up and be able to just shoot in a barrel like that?
Yeah, what we always learn from these things is that people saw some things that, maybe at the time they didn't think too much about it. The see something, say something campaign, I think has to be reevaluated. We have to do a better job of engaging the public so that, we can train them on an ongoing basis. You can't just say, see something, call police or call 911. I mean, see what, right? So I think a better job of educating the public. And that will engage them. Until we get the public fully engaged in this, because police are not omnipresent, it's going to be very hard to stop these things in the future.
David Clark, it's good to see you, sir. Thanks so much. We will see you soon. Sheriff David Clark. President Trump could soon make a big move on the Iran nuclear deal. Will it happen next week? We're talking with Mac Thornberry next. Back in a moment, Chairman of Foreign Affairs. Welcome back. The White House is reportedly moving forward toward pulling the U.S. out of the Iran nuclear deal. The deadline for President Trump to recertify Iran's compliance is a week from today. Joining me right now is Texas Congressman Mac Thornberry. He is chairman of the House Armed Services Committee. And, Mr. Chairman, it's good to have you on the program. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So, what do you think that the president will move to decertify the U.S. and the Iran deal?
I don't know for sure, but I think he may well. I think it's important for everybody to understand that the certification we're talking about is not part of the Iran agreement. It is a reporting requirement to Congress that actually goes beyond the Iran agreement. So it may be that the president says, look, I have concerns about this. They are not letting us into all the sites. I have doubts whether this is in the best interest of the United States, but still not reimpose sanctions, not actually withdraw from the agreement itself.
Okay, so then he pushes it onto Congress, and then you and your colleagues have to decide what action is to be taken. I mean, for example, when you mentioned sanctions, I mean, reinstituting sanctions is one idea, but if the U.S. is doing that alone, does it really matter? Because you've got 5 other countries right here, right, that will weigh in. So even if Congress decides we're going to reduce sanctions, is that really any impact, given that we've got other countries that will have to make a decision on that in that regard as well?
Well, it can have an impact. We're still the biggest, most powerful economy, and we can make a difference. But I think that really the issue, one of the fundamental flaws of the nuclear deal was it just focused very narrowly on their nuclear program, not on the broader range of Iran's malicious activities. And so I think that's the goal of the White House here. Let's have a broader strategy that looks at everything that Iran does, and that may involve sanctions, it may involve a variety of other things, but let's look at this more broadly, not just focus on technical compliance with a flawed agreement.
So if he does not recertify Iran's compliance, what does that mean in terms of congressional action?
Well, it simply means that under congressional procedures, there can be expedited consideration of reimposing sanctions, technically. But the key question, Maria, is what does the president say are his reasons, and what does he ask Congress to do? Again, my hope and what I've encouraged the White House to do is look at this more broadly than just technical compliance with one agreement. And the other thing is that what we're talking about are pieces of paper. What backs up those pieces of paper is the most important thing, and that's hard power, U.S. military power. And so whether we're talking about Iran, North Korea, China, or Russia, the best thing that we could do, however this certification issue comes out, the best thing we could do is get serious about rebuilding and growing our military. That's the ultimate backstop.
So obviously you were happy with the numbers within the budget in terms of military spending?
Well, I'm happy with what the House has passed, with the Senate vote 89-8 on a similar number, and then the President at the UN endorsed those numbers. What I worry about is that people in both parties try to use military spending as a football. Republicans say they'll increase defense spending only if you cut other spending. Democrats say we'll increase defense spending only if you increase other spending. So we need to evaluate defense spending on its merits, look at the threats around the world, like Iran, look at the increasing accident rates, unfortunately, that we're seeing in our military, and do the right thing by them and leave those other issues for other debates.
Yeah, you play with it like it's football. Meanwhile, you've got the military hanging in the balance. We know that our Navy is some of the oldest fleet that we know of, that some of the ships, apparently, or planes rather, are not usable for an actual combat situation. General Jack Keane says it's up to 50% that are not ready.
Yeah, I think most Americans don't know that. For the Navy, half of their planes cannot fly because of mechanical reasons. But let me give you another example. We've had 2 tragic accidents in the Pacific, lost 2 destroyers that are now being repaired. It turns out some of those sailors on those ships were working 100 hours a week.
Wow.
They were deployed so often they never got the training they were supposed to get. Those ships were out of certification because they're always on guard trying to protect us against North Korea. So we need to repair, but we also need to grow because the threats are not shrinking. Unfortunately, we have shrunk our military too much in the past few years.
Yeah, I think you make a lot of important points. Let me ask you about North Korea before you go real quick, because there's this October 10th date floating out there that Kim Jong-un's regime may want to do something in terms of rockets being sent. What is the answer to the North Korean threat that has clearly become much more dangerous?
Well, the number one answer is we need more missile defense right now to protect ourselves and our allies. We also need more ships and planes and munitions right there on China's doorstep to encourage them to be much more aggressive at reining North Korea in. Look, it may come to military confrontation. We can win, but it will be ugly. But the way to prevent war is to be strong. And unfortunately, because of the accidents we were just talking about, we've got 2 fewer destroyers in the Pacific than we had just a few weeks ago.
Wow. This is a dangerous moment in time, for sure. Real quick before you go, let me end where it began. Do you want to see the U.S. pull out of the Iran nuclear deal?
I do not want the U.S. to pull completely out because Iran has already gotten the plane load of cash and a lot of the benefit of it. So, but I do want us to look at everything that Iran's doing, their missile program, the problems they're causing in Yemen, Syria, their conventional, and that's where it comes back to growing and strengthening our own military. To me, that's more important than whatever happens to a piece of paper.
Apparently. Mr. Chairman, good to see you, sir. Thanks very much.
Thank you, ma'am.
And Chairman Mac Thornberry. Meanwhile, the House budget plan seen as a step toward tax reform. How big of a step? The House Ways and Means Committee Chairman Kevin Brady will be back with me live coming up as we look ahead on Sunday Morning Futures. Back in a moment. Welcome back. Well, this is it. The House passing a $4.1 trillion budget just days ago. It is considered the step toward passing tax reform. That does not mean it will be an easy road to get there. Let's talk about it right now with Congressman Kevin Brady. He is joining me right, and he is the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee. And Mr. Chairman, it's good to see you again. Thanks so much for joining us this morning.
Good morning, Maria.
We've been following your work, and you've been doing great in terms of coming forth with a plan and communicating it to the American people. We spoke with you 1 month ago, back in September, and here's what you said about that. Congressman, listen to this.
You'll see details about our business and individual rates that we propose going forward on tax reform, a dramatic simplification of how we tax so families can keep more of what they earn and our businesses can compete anywhere in the world and win, especially here at home.
So where are you now, Mr. Chairman?
Yeah, one big step closer would be the answer. Well, the tax reform budget that passed the House last week is a crucial step. In fact, it can't be skipped, and it really gives us the runway to land pro-growth, pro-middle-class tax reform on. Now goes to the Senate, where there, in my view, there is a sense of urgency on both sides of the Capitol that we get this done. The budget is a major step toward that. And then, from a timing standpoint, once that budget is agreed to from the House and Senate, it is signed, sealed, and delivered, then we'll bring forward the Ways and Means full comprehensive tax reform plan. So
you're expecting that to go to the Senate floor when they come back in a week and a half in the Senate?
That's my understanding, and they continue to push forward. Then the work will be done to reconcile the differences, get that approved, and then we'll move immediately into a House action on the tax reform plan.
Mr. Chairman, let me ask you about the differences. And obviously, one of the issues that we've really been digging deep into and getting real detailed on is this elimination of the deduction of state and local income tax, property tax as well. I was speaking with one of the members of Congress who was in that meeting that you had last week in Steve Scalise's office to talk about the high income states. You had a lot of the representatives from states like New York and New Jersey and Connecticut, et cetera, because they're pushing back and saying if you eliminate this deduction, that's going to mean higher taxes for my constituents. What are you considering in that regard? Would you put a cap on the amount of money you could deduct? Is there a way to get around this, given you're getting so much pushback for the elimination of that one deduction?
Well, look, let's start in that meeting where we agreed, which is we need to lower taxes at every level for all Americans, regardless if they're in a low-tax state or a high-tax state. That's the first point. Second is they like the postcard approach, where we keep the home mortgage deduction, the charitable incentives, the child tax credit, and helping people with college. Absolute agreement there. What we're trying to do is find a way forward to make sure that those who are in high-tax states, like New York and Illinois and California, see tax relief as well. It's stunning how high their property taxes, their sales taxes when they go to the store, their income taxes are. And as you know, the current tax code double taxes most Americans, taxes them high at the local level, then taxes them artificially high at the federal level to give a tax break for some. So we're working to make sure that we can provide tax relief for families in those high tax states as well.
So are you considering right now putting a cap on the deduction? Like, for example, if you make any more than $400,000, is that the number? Then you can't deduct it.
Yeah, not necessarily, no. We're talking about making sure that we're lowering the tax rates at every level. That's why we have not yet decided on what those income tax brackets will be to make sure that we can address and create tax relief at every income level. We're especially driving a very strong middle-class tax relief in President Trump's reforms. We intend to do that up and down the level, and so I think really the focus will be more on the where those brackets are set and how we address that painful subject of property taxes. Man, that hurts families in every state. And so we're looking at that from a home ownership and from a local deduction issue.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, in for example, a Peter King district, you're talking about property taxes on, average people at $15,000 and up, $25,000 in property taxes, even more in some areas. So would you consider a cap on that? Is that what you're looking at, different levels? And if you make or have that kind of a cost higher than a certain number, then maybe you will be able to deduct it?
Well, not necessarily. So too early to tell. That's why we're having these discussions right now and trying to find out, what is that median household in Peter King's district? We know it's around $70,000, but that family of four is a little over $100 and some $1,000. They may well be itemizing. Let's look at how we deliver relief for them, because right now, look, they're getting taxed high locally. They're getting artificially taxed higher at the federal level out of Washington. Now, how do we stop that double taxation? How do we make sure we lower those rates and people just pay what their local taxes are? That's, we think, what the key is.
That is exactly the point. And you look at a Governor Cuomo, and he says this: remember, New York State is the #1 donor state to the federal government. We pay $48 billion more in taxes than we get back. Then they take away the deductibility of state and local because they don't want to subsidize New York State. What do you say to him?
Well, I don't know Governor Cuomo. I just get a little suspicious when the same politicians who've been working so high to raise your taxes are suddenly concerned about your welfare. And the truth of the matter is, right now, unfortunately, in some states, these same people are raising taxes at every level, trying to shift that onto others, including working class families who don't itemize. And so our whole point is this: why don't we stop all that gamesmanship? Why don't we lower taxes at the federal level for every American, regardless of where they live, so they can keep more of what they earn?
Yeah, I think you lay it out pretty specific and straightforwardly there. Let's talk about the corporate side of things, because I know that that's really moving the needle on economic growth you expect. The fact that you're taking the rate to 20%. The president said the corporate rate red line is 20%. Is there any expectation? Are you getting any pushback that people want to see that corporate rate any higher than that?
No, I really am not. In fact, we think that's the sweet spot in a major way. And not only will it allow our companies to compete and win, it'll allow Main Street businesses to keep more of what they earn so they can invest more in their workers and their success in their community. And what we know, too, is, look, we get this right so our businesses can compete and win anywhere in the world, including here at home. Guess what happens? Paychecks go up. That's what we're really driving toward. Families having more money in their pocketbook, and lowering the tax rates a key part of it. Increasing their paychecks, well, that's another important part of it.
Yeah, I mean, it feels like we've got 2 steps forward, 2 steps back in terms of the economy. We did not get a great jobs number out this last Friday, but that was, I guess, distorted by the hurricanes. How would you characterize things right now?
Yeah, I think that is the case. But you know what? I think the big picture here is it's been 31 years since Washington's changed its tax code. Our competitors around the world, China, Europe, Canada, Mexico, boy, they've all modernized their tax codes, lowered their rates, simplified them. Look, they're just handing our heads to us on the tax code. So we've got to compete and win. We've got to modernize it. We've got to simplify and be pro-growth. If we do that, our businesses on Main Street, in every community in this country will be stronger, hiring more and increasing those paychecks.
Well, it sounds like you are going to get this done, Mr. Chairman. It's good to talk with you, and we'll be following it. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Maria.
Chairman Kevin Brady joining us there. President Trump says he has still full confidence in his Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson. Could his days be numbered? Our political panel is up next as we look ahead on Sunday Morning Futures. Right next. Welcome back. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson last week shooting down reports that he actually considered resigning over the summer. Then President Trump told reporters that he has a good relationship with the secretary, but that Tillerson could be, quote, a little bit tougher at times. Let's bring in our panel right now. Al D'Amato is with me here. He's the former New York Senator, Fox News contributor. Rich Lowry is with us this morning, editor at National Review. Great to see you both. Thank you so much for being here. Your thoughts on what went down last week in terms of Rex Tillerson?
Look, obviously, when the president tweets that you're wasting your time, etc., that is not being supportive. Now, if it was a well thought out, planned initiative by the government so that it looks like good cop, bad cop, so that Tillerson and Mathis, the Secretary of Defense, can go and say to their people that they're talking to, listen.
I don't think that was good cop, bad cop.
But that would be an excuse for it.
Acceptable.
But let me tell you, losing a Secretary of State would be a sign of disarray and weakness, not strength. And that's the last thing we need to happen. And I don't think Tillerson will resign because I think Mathis respects him, wants him, and I think he's going to stay the course.
Rich?
It feels like a decent interval to me. For the reasons the senator outlines, they don't want him to go now. Just after he had another cabinet minister quit in the form of Tom Price. But he has not been a good Secretary of State. I mean, he's an impressive man. When you ascend to the heights of ExxonMobil, you're kind of the president of a quasi-country. So he's very accomplished, but he doesn't have a good relationship with the president, doesn't have a good relationship with the civil service in that building, doesn't have a relationship with the media, with Congress, or with the foreign policy establishment. There's just a very thin layer of Rex Tillerson and a couple loyalists at Foggy Bottom, and he's out of sympathy with Trump's foreign policy goals. So all that adds up to not a very good tenure. So
I didn't understand that press conference that he gave last week. You would think that when you don't want the media to hang on something that you said, you don't say it again. You don't come out in a press conference and say, I didn't say this. So it was, but we'll see. I think all the reasons that you say are right. I mean, he can't step down now.
No, he can't. It would be a disaster.
But they would put Nikki Haley right in there. You know that.
Let me say this to you. It's just not a good sign.
Yeah.
And I believe that two of the people that the president respects the most, that is his chief of staff and that is the Secretary of Defense, are strong allies of Tillerson continuing on. Again, it sends the wrong signal.
Right, and so many issues on the foreign policy, scorecard here. I mean, whether it's Iran and is he going to decertify rather, and then there's North Korea, Rich, and then there's the fight between the Saudis and the Qataris. I mean, there's a lot going on where you need to have the president and his Secretary of State.
But on every single one of those things, Tillerson is a different place than the president is.
Exactly.
And look, his instincts need to be refined and channeled. You don't want his Twitter feed establishing U.S. foreign policy, but you need to be in sympathy with the fundamental goals. And that's why I think in the medium term, he'd be better served by having a Secretary of State who's Mike Pompeo, CIA director, Nikki Haley would be another alternative, John Bolton, but someone who gets what he wants to do and then works with him on it.
Yeah, you would think. All right, we'll take a break. I wanted to ask you about the other positions in the White House and what's next. We've got more with our panel when we come right back. We're looking ahead on Sunday Morning Futures right now. Stay with us.